Well, boils and ghouls, it's your old pal, John Kassir, the voice of the Cryptkeeper. And I want to welcome my good fiends of the Horror Heals podcast. Is horror good for mental wellness? But of course it is. I delight in the delicious deaths of pitiful people on the silver screen. So get ready for a hell of a good time with my new fiends, Corey and Kendall, on the Horror Heals podcast.
Welcome to the Horror Heals podcast. I'm one of your co-hosts, Kendall Austin Stulce.
I'm Corey Stulce, and that voice sounded very familiar at the intro, didn't it?
It did.
That was voice of the Cryptkeeper, John Kassir, who graciously agreed to do our introduction. The Horror Heals podcast is all about the therapeutic benefits of horror movies, horror culture, horror art, novels, comic books, the whole gamut, how it's all good for our mental wellness. In the Horror Heals podcast, we're going to be interviewing horror celebrities, artisans who work in a variety of media to create horror-themed artwork, and horror fans who are open to talking about their own experiences with horror and mental wellness. Kendall and I have been partners in life for almost 20 years and partners in podcasting for 2 years with our existing podcast, Family Twist. And we decided, as huge horror fans and two people that definitely benefit from the therapeutic relief of horror movies, we decided it was time to do a horror podcast. Kendall and I were both introduced to horror at a young age. Kendall, do you want to talk a little bit about your introduction to horror through your adoptive parents?
My parents, I knew, always loved horror films and books and anything they could get their hands on. But my mother was very hesitant to allow me to be involved in anything they watched or read. But my dad kind of sneaked things in on her. But she put her foot down about some things, and one of the things that I remember vividly when the television version of The Exorcist came out when I was 6, and I really wanted to watch it because I had already heard buzz about the film, and it seemed, just in theory, as something I would like. But of course I was forbidden, and for good reason. I think lots of 6-year-olds could not handle that level of intensity. And a lot of adults couldn't handle that level of intensity. But my parents put me to bed one night, and I don't know what night of the week it would have been on, but they settled down on the couch in the den to watch The Exorcist. And I remember knowing that that's what they were going to do and sneaking down the hall and lying with my head barely in the den where my parents couldn't have seen it from where they were on the couch. And I was watching it along with them until it got to when Linda Blair's character's head starts spinning around. That's when I gasped. And I remember my mother very vividly saying, "Oh no," because she realized what was happening, that I was there. And of course, my dad took me back to my bedroom and put me back to bed and said, "You're not supposed to be in there." And they continued watching it, of course, because for people who are young, you won't remember the days when you couldn't pause live television. And that was just one of the first times that I did the sneaky thing and watched a film or read a book that I shouldn't have. And when I say shouldn't have, that's only because I think of the social mores of the time, because I was never scared. I enjoyed it. I never minded reading horror or watching horror. And I think it's because my parents normalized it for me really early on and made it not scary because they told me it was make-believe, which Corey and I will talk about, I'm sure, at length on this podcast. But I don't believe in spirit stuff. Like, I didn't believe that it really happened, that Reagan McNeil's head really spun around. Come on, let's get real. We will probably debate things like that on this podcast because I had this healthy skepticism. It never bothered me. And I think that has served me well throughout my life.
Well, it's funny that The Exorcist was one of the first things you were exposed to, the TV version, because same for me. And there's a 5-year age difference between us. So I'm not sure which year it was that my mom was watching The Exorcist on TV, but I, too, was also intrigued and wanted to see it, or at least hear it. I sneaked down the hall after bedtime and stayed just out of sight of my mom. And once I heard the voice of the demon, like, I about lost it. That just sent me off, because I think I'm a little bit more open to the idea of otherworldly stuff, demons, spirits, that sort of thing. And woo! Flipped me out. But it's funny that here we are, however many years later, and Kendall and I both consider The Exorcist to be our favorite horror movie.
Yep, still do. I think I always will, and I don't know if it's connected to that first viewing and that first excitement and the fact that it was forbidden and all of those things, but I just love it. It's, quote, based on a true story, which makes me laugh. But I just love it. I thought Linda Blair did a great job. I thought the other actors did great jobs.
Kendall thinks it's funny, but I did a little bit of investigation into the true story behind The Exorcist because I'm from St. Louis, and that's where the supposed exorcism took place. We'll be definitely digging into that with a future episode that we've already recorded. I think one of the reasons why Kendall and I realized that this theme for the podcast would be helpful for us is obviously we're both gay. And I think growing up and watching horror movies and really identifying with the characters, and there's the popular term final girl, but we're going to say final person on this podcast. But I think we definitely identified with those characters who were outsiders, who found a way to persevere or who found the courage to do bigger things. And while this isn't necessarily a horror movie, it's science fiction, I definitely identified with the character Elliot from E.T. when I was a little kid. I think I was age 6 or 7 when I first saw that. And there was just something about that character and his bond with E.T. and his drive to make sure that, E.T. got back home that really spoke to me. We've already mentioned our other podcast, Family Twist, which is all about DNA surprises and adoption stories and stories of donor-conceived people. And the reason we started that podcast is back in 2017, I got a DNA kit for Kendall on his birthday, and he took it. And within just a handful of weeks, Kendall and his half-brother connected, which was pretty amazing. So at this point, we were living in San Francisco. We'd moved from St. Louis to San Francisco 9 years earlier, and we did that almost on a whim. It was August when Kendall first connected with his half-brother Chris. And within 2 months, we were in New England visiting them. And thank goodness, in Worcester, Mass, there was a horror con going on that weekend. We were excited to find out that Kendall's half-sister Monica was a huge horror fan. In fact, named her son Gage after the Pet Sematary movie. A lot of us went to this horror con together. It was just fantastic. There were several people there from the Friday the 13th series. I was just sharing the story with everybody because I think we were so just still excited and buzzing from this meeting new family. And soon enough, we found ourselves smack dab in the middle of a photo with Kane Hodder, who played Jason in Friday the 13th, 7 through 10. And he was just fantastic. I think we all really had really good vibes about meeting him for whatever reason. And in subsequent years, I've run into Kane at several horror conventions. He always remembers the story. Just a very, very cool dude. And I think that sort of gets us into why I think horror is good for our mental wellness. There's just this sense of camaraderie and togetherness that these outsiders feel when we get together at a horror convention or a horror screening or a book signing or whatever. Horror fans, they're from all walks of life. Everybody comes together in this big old soup of whatever. There's something kind of magical about it.
As Corey mentioned, we got to go to that horror convention in Worcester, Mass. with my brand new family. It was a first, of course, because we didn't know that family, but it was a first for me as well because it was my first ever horror con. Corey had taken me to other conventions like comic book conventions and pop culture conventions, but I agree with Corey, those had a different vibe. And I really enjoyed the time that I was in Worcester. And back then, I used to question whether I was just feeling euphoric because I'd found my brand new family, but I don't think so. I think it really was a good setting and, as Corey mentioned, very accepting of us. Because as a gay couple coming from San Francisco, we didn't know exactly what to expect in suburban Massachusetts in general, but it was a great experience.
Yeah, I think getting together with like-minded people, yes, we love the gore and the excitement and the thrills and everything, but at the end of the day, we're all just really nice, good people. I mean, the horror community will bend over backward for each other. There's just something really, really special about this group of people. We'll get into the story, the specific story as to where this podcast was inspired in the next couple of episodes. But we just wanted to take this opportunity to introduce ourselves and just wanted to let everybody know that we take horror and mental wellness very seriously. Our other podcast, Family Twist, as we've mentioned, each story that we tell on there deals with some kind of family trauma. And as we've done 15 or 20 of these interviews for Horror Heals so far, it's the same. It's not just the fans or the artists, it's the celebrities too, as you'll find out, who have experienced trauma and have found healing through the horror fans, which I think is just fantastic. We're super, super thrilled that horror legend Dee Wallace is our first guest. So please take a listen to that episode.